Alrighty, welcome back to Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we have a new literary venture. Um, we're going to be reading Bear v. Shark, the novel by Chris Bachelder. Bachelder? I'm not actually sure how his name is pronounced. If somebody else knows and wants to reveal that information, please feel free. Otherwise, we will keep crack-a-lacking and proceed as if I know what I'm doing, which I do. Absolutely. So this book is a satire, and it is a satire in the Kurt Vonnegutian style, which is to say it is not necessarily a funny, happy, scrappy, haha, how goofy book. It is that, but it's also something a bit more than that. And Chris Batchelder has a preface, a preface that will kind of explain, list this out. It's also the preface is also navel gazing gobbledygook in many ways. It's goofy. You'll see. The chapters are very short, so I can pretty much cut off wherever the heck I damn well please, which is nice. Let me plop in a bookmark right there, actually. And yeah, so this is going to be a fun one. Um, in Frag specific news, I have now successfully read through Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer, and it is a doozy. Um, it is a prequel. That's pretty much all I will tell you. I mean, we already knew this. This was known. This was already known in advance. I'll reveal no further about the plot. Suffice it to say, however, there are a few familiar faces, but not as many as you might think, and not necessarily the ones you'll expect. It's pretty good. We will be getting to it. It doesn't tick every box. There are certain aspects that remind me of Dead Astronauts, also by Jeff Vandermeer, and I like that book, but it's a very bewildering read, and parts of this were like that. Um, but mostly it's in terms of how it's written and where you place things in the chronology. And there's reasons why that is made extra confusing, and those will become clear when we get to it. But that is not what we're reading for this week and the next several on Wednesdays, because we're going to be reading Bear v. Shark, the novel by Chris Bachelder, which is not like that. At all, in fact, other than it takes place in America. That's, uh, that's about it. So going into this, I wanted to do something by Chris Batchelder. He actually has a book on the internet for free that you can read, which I recommend, entitled Lessons in Virtual Tour Photography, with the subtitle of Drive Around, Take Pictures, Make Money. And it is goofy. I think it's his first novel, but I'm not 100% sure. I have not actually read it yet. So I recommend that to anyone who wants to check him out for free. You can get that, I think, on his Wikipedia page, if not his website. It's definitely on his Wikipedia page. Where is that? It's on mcsweeney's.net. I'll post a link here. And that too is a satire. You can see how he started cutting his teeth. I'm posting that in chat so people can check that out. That is not for this book, I regret to say, but it is for another one of his. So you can, if you like this, you can check that out. There's an. I'll try and take time to read that when I'm not stuck legs deep in my backlog of reading. I've started reading through The Nightlands by or The Nightland singular, The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson. Thank you to whoever recommended that. I want to say it was a cookie, but I don't remember for sure. Suffice to say, that is a lot of fun. I was told going into it by someone else I asked about it, what to expect, and they were like, "Oh, it's pretty cool, but the prose is brutal. It's really hard to read as a result." And I would have ordinarily agreed if it weren't for the fact that I just got through reading Frankenstein, which is harder for sure. So at some point, I will get around to reading The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson on stream, as requested. I don't know when that will be. But without further ado, we will get cracking on Bear v. Shark, the novel. It opens with a metaphysical and metaphorical question. Which basically is, who'd win in a fight? A bear or a shark? Assuming you had a level playing field, i.e. the water deep enough for the shark to swim in, but shallow enough for the bear to walk in, etc. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Bear v. Shark, the novel, by Chris Bachelder. Lord Clifford says, "The smallest worm will turn, being trodden upon." King Henry VI, Part 3. Kurt Vonnegut, Jr. says, "This is meant to be optimistic, I think, but I have to tell you that a worm can be stepped on in such a way that it can't possibly turn after you remove your foot." Address to a graduating class at Bennington College. Bear v. Shark. The Preface. Bear v. Shark, the novel, is based on a true story. Or rather, it is based on a true story. Imagine a true story. Imagine this true story in a solid middle-class neighborhood, modest and truthful. Imagine its joists, its beams, the steady, cautious slope of its shingled roof. Imagine its crisp, righteous corners, those near-perfect 90-degree angles, knowing, as you do, that a perfect 90-degree angle, like a perfect circle or a perfect butt, doesn't really exist in the real world, but knowing that these angles have aspired to perfection nonetheless, or else what's a heaven for? Imagine the clean closets, the sensible floor plan, the utter lack of luxury or flourish. Imagine that the materials are first rate, chosen and guaranteed by men who care about doing a job right, damn it! Imagine that everything checks out. Yes, the basement is unfinished and dank, but it's the truth. Take it or leave it. Good.
Now, imagine, based atop this monument to forthrightness and plain dealing, imagine a ramshackle unit constructed willy-nilly, catch as catch can, higgledy-piggledy, all pastiche together with hyphens, and so he's going to do this to me occasionally. uh, the reason that's funny, all pastiche together with hyphens, is the last several phrases, willy-nilly, catch as catch can, higgledy-piggledy, are all hyphenated. It's all hyphens between. Now, imagine, based atop this monument to forthrightness and plain dealing, imagine a ramshackle unit constructed willy-nilly, catch as catch can, higgledy-piggledy, all pastiche together with hyphens, and the thin, colorful threads of ideas, a motley edifice, part bungalow, part high-rise, part rambler. There's stucco and brick and wood and vinyl siding. Not unplanned, charming or interesting being the absolute best way to describe this place if you're standing on the bushwhacked front lawn of truth. Not unstable in its own right, but perched upon, based on, the cautious, steady slope of the shingled roof of truth, and teetering the whole damn situation, fixing to collapse into tainted wreckage, in which wreckage lie nearly equal parts truth and lie, irony and that which is not irony, such that context and purity are forever lost, and the pieces are indistinguishable. How shall I regard that naily 2x4? Is it a meta-plank, a super-plank, a plank self-referential? A complex and ambiguous plank, and all the more so for its apparent simplicity, its garish honesty regarding its own dimensions? Has anyone even bothered to measure the 2x4? In short, is this a postmodern stick? Say, are we to look through or at that cracked window? Linoleum, authenticity or the death of authenticity? Imagine that. And now this, Part 1. The Broad Flapping American Ear. 1. Parlor game.
So it's kind of like a parlor game then, in essence?
I guess so.
Well, that sounds fun. Bear against shark.
It's Bear v. Shark. What's a parlor?
Oh, a parlor.
A parlor.
Huh? Like a salon.
What?
A lounge, essentially.
A lounge game?
Well, it's like where you play it.
What's a parlor?
Like a living room, technically.
Parlor?
Yes,
In a building?
in a home.
How big a TV you putting there? 2. Whiteout. The television, the couch, the main character, Mr. Norman, asleep, twitching in the strobe glow. The television says, "Don't you go away, we'll be right back." Mr. Norman is all twitch and mutter. He doesn't go away. There's American-style shag carpet, and there's wood paneling wallpaper. I couldn't tell the difference. You fooled me. Where's the seam? It's morning. Rise and shine. And then, from dreams grainy and edge blurry, cold sizzling with synaptic crack and static, Mr. Norman opens his eyes into the titillating snow-white throb of a cordless vibrating pillow, the Vibra Dream Plus, not available in stores. Order today. This blindingly white pillow, for which operators are standing by, cradles Mr. Norman's face and curves seductively, ergonomically, up to his ears, into which it purrs and coos like a lover. The pillow lover says, "3 easy payments." She says, "For a limited time only, void where prohibited, ergonomically designed." She says, "Check the cordless pillow aisle at your local grocer." On television, it's the same thing. Ergonomically, from the Latin ergo, therefore, and the French nom, name. Into the soft white fleece of his virgin lover, Mr. Norman says, "Therefore name?" She, the pillow, doesn't care whether Mr. Norman used Visa or MasterCard, or whether he ordered by toll-free number or via the internet or even through the painfully and deliciously slow U.S. Postal Service. She, the pillow, just wants Mr. Norman to rest easy after a long day at the office. She understands. She cares. She grazes his earlobes when she speaks. With her thrumming tongue, her tingling lips, the pillow lover says, "Therefore name." It makes sense. Her design? Well, her design combines old world comfort with space age materials. She is the official cordless pillow of Bear v. Shark 2. Mr. Norman's neck hurts, but she, the revolutionary pillow of tomorrow, says, "You be still, big boy." She says, "Stain resistant, lab tested, stylish durability." Mr. Norman, penis erect and warranty expired, remains face down on the couch in the big television room of his suburban home, his eyes squinting into a whiteout of sexy sleep technology, a hot blizzard of affordable comfort, and Yankee can-do know-how. In a manner of speaking, Mr. Norman wakes up. 3. Ohms and amperes. A wife, Mrs. Norman, and 2 boys all asleep upstairs. We got ourselves a quiet house. This suburban house is completely and blessedly silent. One thinks of wind-kissed meadows. One thinks of bomb shelters. The house is completely silent, except only for those trifling noises against which we recognize and understand the very idea of silence, the rustle and pulse that we might say define silence, yes, bring it into existence and lock it into a paired opposition that confers meaning and context. The silent house. Silent, that is, except for the chemical hum of the central air conditioning, except for the hiss of dehumidifiers, except for the Babelic chatter of televisions. Silent but for the synthetic pulse of coaxial cables, converters, underground fiber optic lines, the crackle and pop of electricity, currency, frequency, the ohms and amperes, watts and volts. All silent, except for the thud of the land swaps and divorces against vinyl siding, except for the clicking of the hard drive, the murmuring of website authors, Charles Lindbergh deniers, child pornographers, auctioneers, insomniacs, quilters, captains of industry, professors of Canadian literature. Except for the gunshots, the sirens, the gunshots, the choppers. Except for bear banter, shark schlock. Except for the inexorable grind of continental plates miles below the Earth's surface. Miles? Silent, except for the utopian drone of the Vibra Dream Plus and the sweet, sweet morning songs of electric birds installed in the imitation dogwoods in the backyard of Mr. Norman's suburban cable-ready home. Fax, scanner, cell phone. You shoot a bear so many times, and it still doesn't die. The house is completely silent when Mr. Norman awakes. 4. Lady v. Cake. On the television, on a television, a lady lawyer in a low-cut silk blouse is cross-examining a chocolate cake. The lady lawyer, pacing like TV lawyers will, has great calves, a nice thin waist, full-bodied hair, no panty lines. All of the lady lawyer's unwanted hair is off screen somewhere, removed and hidden in bloody waste paper baskets, unwanted. She looks fantastic, but a little crazy in the eyes, a little sharp in the nose and chin, a little too aggressive, a little too skeptical of modern dessert technology. The chocolate cake, seated up at the witness stand in front of a microphone and next to a stern, fair-minded, balding, middle-aged white male TV commercial judge, the other two types of TV commercial judges being one, a stern, fair-minded, middle-aged, gray-haired white woman, and two, a stern, fair-minded black woman, any age. The cake, I say, looks every bit as hot as the lady lawyer, and innocent to boot. This chocolate cake appears utterly incapable of the smallest misdemeanor. The cake is rich, luscious, moist, exotically frosted. From the courtroom scene cut to a close-up of the nude cake being sliced open, its moistness revealed in pornographic slow motion. This cake is begging to be frosted. She, this cake, is both vixen and virgin. She is perfect. Women want to identify with her, create her, and thus recreate themselves, mix her and bake her at 375 degrees, fill the kitchen with her sweet perfume. Men want to devour her. Cut back to the courtroom scene. The lady lawyer says,
If it is indeed true that you are from a mix, would you mind telling the jury just how you got to be so creamy?
there's a little boy in the Normans' front yard. The front yards around here are paved and painted green. The grass doesn't do so well. Face down in the Vibram Dream Plus, Mr. Norman does not know. Was Grizzly Adams the name of the bearded guy or the bear? 5. The Old Televisions, Part 1. The old televisions had an off switch. Chapter 6. 10 Myths About Babbling. Man on a couch, beached and chatty. He, Mr. Norman, says, "That's probably not going to be enough for a first down." He says, "Plantigrade gate, liquidation sale, murder-suicide." An expert says,
We believe that it is generally most severe in the mornings.
4 out of 5 experts say,
We recommend Babble Blocker, a prescription drug.
nobody says, isn't the pharmaceutical company part of the same conglomerate as the television networks? The Babble Blocker pamphlet, 10 Myths About Babbling, says, Myth number 3. People who babble are nutbags. Fact. Logorrhea has nothing to do with sanity or intelligence. The institutionalization of babblers is generally no longer accepted as the best method of treatment. Most babblers can lead productive lives, and some even achieve greatness. Mr. Norman says, Liquor? I hardly know her. Myth number 5. I must be the only person in the world who babbles. Fact. You are not alone. Over 10 million Americans have been diagnosed with logorrhea. The evil, sexy lady lawyer badgers the cake. She's a real bitch. She says,
You sit there all sweet and scrumptious, and you expect us to believe that you are fat-free?
Mr. Norman says not all antifungal ointments are the same. Myth number 8. Babble Blocker turns you into a zombie and also slowly erodes your kidneys. Fact. Although BB tends to induce lethargy, glassy-eyed compliance, and kidney erosion in laboratory rats and monkeys, recent longitudinal studies suggest that humans do not suffer these same side effects to nearly the same extent. Side effects include dry mouth headaches, ennui, vomiting, ejaculatory failure, sweating, irritability, color blindness, and memory loss. Someone, maybe in the kitchen or the small television room, says now take a look at the stain on the right. Myth number 10. There's no cure for babbling. The cross-examined cake, of course, is polite, demure, sheepish, non-confrontational, sexy as all get out. She, the chocolate cake, says, "Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am." The phrase has caught on with the kids. Hipsters in Chicago, Wheeling, West Virginia, and Beijing go around imitating that cake. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It means the same thing as, say, cool, or right on, or you're shitting me. There is a website devoted to Lady V Cake, 15,000 hits per day. There are internet chat rooms where people from all nations meet to discuss the finer points of law and food porn. The cake is on a book signing tour. Chapter 7. Mile marker number 68. All this silence is getting to Mr. Norman. His neck hurts. He feels restless. He lifts his face out of the warm lap of the Vibradream Plus, despite her protestations, her seductive offers, and money-back guarantees. On TV, a man in a tuxedo is sprinting through a sunny neighborhood with an ice cream cone. Mr. Norman works in an office, but not today. He works on a team that designs fake electronic equipment for model apartments and townhomes, but not today. Today is a vacation day. Mr. Norman feels like running a 10-kilometer race. That is how far? 10 kilometers is roughly 10,000 meters. A meter is roughly a yard is roughly 3 feet, a mile is... What the hell is a country mile? What about a nautical mile? How would a crow fly underwater? League, stadium, fathom. No, a marathon, or an ultra-marathon, one of those 100-mile races through the desert. Mr. Norman saw that once on the Outrageous Accomplishments Network. These people running 100 miles, running from something or towards something, who knows, just running for days and drinking literally pints and pints of fluids. These gaunt fellows, what have they figured out? The design team doesn't do fake plants. That's another office. They just do fake electronic equipment for model apartments and townhomes. Well, it started out for model apartments and townhomes, but lately regular folks have been buying the fake equipment because it looks better than the real equipment, and it is competitively priced. Mr. Norman imagines himself in the white-hot sands, covered with the crusty white residue of his sweat, the vultures circling in the high white heat above. His eyes are fixed, his face is placid, serene. He has found something. He has reached some sort of enlightenment out there in the desert at mile marker number 68. He has passed through pain and he has found something sublime. The now. It's like buying a Lexus or getting drunk, only better, more Eastern. It's extreme Zen. In this moment of transcendence, Mr. Norman's shorts and singlet and shoes would be spotty, yet durable and functional. They would breathe. The logo would be recognized internationally. The design team knows nothing about electronic equipment except the way it looks. Team members scour gadget catalogs like porno mags. They have to keep up with technology. They have to keep up with the way technology looks. Team members email each other when they have new ideas about how to make a fake piece of equipment look more real than a real piece of equipment. Oh, and then the choice that every ultra athlete faces at one time or another. Should I break my rhythm and my concentration for a short bathroom break, or just piss on myself? Mr. Norman wonders if pissing on himself would impress his sponsors or just turn them off. You could really see it both ways. He supposes it could be edited out if they didn't like it. Fake televisions, fake VCRs, fake CD players, fake laptops. Mr. Norman wants to suck down a tube of Dr. Endurance energy goo and throw it in the sand. Mr. Norman can't remember the last time he ran, even a few steps. He says, 90 days, same as cash. He says, how many meters in an odometer? A TV personality in the spare television room says, did you know, Gloria, that the origin of the teddy bear comes more or less from Franklin Delano Roosevelt? With great effort, Mr. Norman turns himself over on the couch. He lies on his back now, the pillow lover picking up where she left off, the electric birds going at it in the imitation dogwoods. He folds his arms over his chest. He sees the cacti, asparagi, octopi, walrus. He feels the brutal sun a million miles away. 10 million, whatever. It's a star like other stars, gaseous, bigger than Jupiter, involved in photosynthesis. He thinks the hot urine might feel good streaming down his sinewy, enlightened legs. Or maybe it would feel bad. Either way. As he does every morning, he vomits sentences, phrases, jingles, until there are just words, then syllables, a long, dry, incomprehensible heave. That little kid in the front yard walks tight figure eights with his head down. He stops occasionally, stares up at the Norman's dark house. She, Gloria, says, Trent, my kids love their teddy sharks. They just love them. Mr. Norman becomes aware of his heartbeat. With his hands on his chest, he can feel his own four-chambered heart pumping blood and riboflavin throughout his body. Turns out it isn't shaped like a heart. Capillaries, aorta, ventricle, plate tectonics, Valentine's Day. Somewhere a gun says, flesh is weak, motherfucker. Somewhere a siren says, you just wouldn't believe what they can do with artificial limbs these days. Somewhere a diamond pendant says, I love you. A bald guy on the Pundit Network says it's not a matter of whether we distribute guns in the schools, but when. 7 chapters of the guy hasn't gotten off the couch yet. In the palms of his folded hands, Mr. Norman feels the beating, the creepy beating of heart under bone. Chapter 8 4-minute guarantee. Here at News 8, we know you live a busy, hectic life. We know that you juggle work and entertainment and family, and that your time is your most precious natural resource. Most other stations give you the day's news in 6 minutes, but in our crazy and hectic world, who has time for 6 minutes of news? That's why we at News 8 give you our 4-minute guarantee. You give us 4 minutes, and we'll give you the planet. Weather, sports, news, and in-depth analysis of current events, all in 4 minutes, or our name isn't News 8. And tonight, after News 8, join us for our ongoing series, Bear v. Shark, The Tale of the Tape. Tonight, we focus on the tongue factor. Do sharks have one? Tune in at 10:04. Chapter 9 Patented Comfort System. Not even light yet. Mr. Norman roaming his house, socks on carpet, the soft rustle like artificial sweetener in decaf. Room to room to room. I mean, a bear, yes, of course, would and can, but a shark does and just might also. Rows of triangular teeth. On TV, well, a man and a woman. Together. Vigorously and imaginatively. Is that her leg? And what's that? Is she having the time of her life, or is he hurting her? Are they in love, these people on the greasy counter of the fast food restaurant? Not the characters, who after all just met. Can I take your order? Okay, bend over. But the actors. Are the actors in love? Do they live together in a ranch-style house on the edge of town? A give-and-take marital situation, all about compromise and communication? Communication is key. With knickknacks on the shelves, photos in albums, this eerie deal where each finishes the other's sentences? Is their love-making gentle, traditional, face-to-face and with no animals or power tools? In the hallway, Mr. Norman pauses, sees the televised sex act reflected on the sad gray face of the family's old broken TV. I'm afraid it's gone, a guy in a jumpsuit had said 6 months ago. The use of condiments in that way, it requires love, does it not? Love and trust? Or hatred and vengeance? Or massive indifference? It requires something. Man, look out, here comes the manager, and he's not wearing pants. Mr. Norman, up the stairs to his son's room. A poster on the door, a collage of tooth and claw. Do not enter. Mr. Norman enters. Curtis, in his fake bearskin sleeping bag, giggles and says, Ruptured Achilles tendon. Matthew looks sullen even in sleep, like he thinks sleeping is stupid. Both children are breathing in and out. They're alive. Something in the room is beeping, not rhythmically. Electronic football beeps like that. Basketball, too. Electronic war also beeps like that, and so does laser archery. Sleeping kids. The blank, naked faces, unstimulated. Mr. Norman feels he should feel something. He does feel a little something. Yes, there it is, and he wonders if it is a flood of love. There it is again. That would seem to be the logical thing, looking at one's sleeping children, a flood of love. But what does a love flood feel like? Would he know one? Is it often mistaken for indigestion? Are there tests? Is there a battery of tests? Can we rule anything out? Does a love flood leave behind soggy scraps of sentiment glistening on the banks of your heart? Beep, beep, beep. Mr. Norman goes to his bedroom, his handsome wife. Through the blinds, are those the first rays of a glorious new day? Is that the life giver rising yonder in the east? No, it's just a street light. The metallic frames of bedside photographs gleam, but the pictures remain black, inscrutable. Mr. Norman can't remember the images inside those frames. Probably him, Mrs. Norman, the boys, squinting in sunshine, mouths turned up to resemble smiles. Mr. Norman sits on the edge of the mattress, which is really a patented comfort system with microcoils that overlap and interlock like chapters in a novel. Mrs. Norman turns in her sleep. She says, What? Mr. Norman says, I mean, just think about it. Mrs. Norman says, You're here. Mr. Norman says, Be as honest as you can. Mrs. Norman says, Right now, let's. Mr. Norman says, Promise? Mrs. Norman used to be such a great water skier. It's not like she could do fancy tricks, it's just that she was so graceful and easy on the water, smiling in the spray. She says nothing, but sort of moans from the back of her throat. Her head rests on the merest suggestion of a pillow, just the idea of a pillow, really, the unpillow, lost in a standard size case, wafer thin and neck friendly, $85 plus S&H. Mrs. Norman is a disciple of posture. Mr. Norman looks up at the dark ceiling. He says, I just need to know. Mrs. Norman says, I'm right over here. Mr. Norman crawls under the comforter, but he's on top of the lightweight, wrinkle-free sheet, and his wife is underneath it, and he can't find her, and they toss and wrestle and grunt, while the mattress subtly conforms and adjusts to their marriage. That's not her breast, it's her shoulder, and soon she's mumbling and sleep-breathing again, her patented spinal corset creaking slightly with each breath. Mr. Norman in the dark. It's going to be a big day, a big weekend. If something is wrong, and I'm not saying something is wrong, but if something is wrong, it will be set right this weekend. Won't it? Mr. Norman says, "Honey." The bedside photographs like small broken televisions. Mr. Norman says, "Honey, am I fun?" Chapter 10. Bear v. Shark. The Question. The question is simple, as are most profound questions. Given a relatively level playing field, i.e., water deep enough so that a shark could maneuver proficiently, but shallow enough so that a bear could stand and operate with its characteristic dexterity, who would win in a fight between a bear and a shark? Chapter 11. Weather Europe. You should know by now, the Normans of America are going to Las Vegas for the sequel, Darwin's Duel, Surf Against Turf, Lungs v. Gills, in the Neon Desert for all the marbles. Mrs. Norman and the two boys, Matthew and Curtis, are awake. They're getting ready. It's pretty exciting. Mrs. Norman's electronic mail message says, "This is going to be fun." The electronic message, says, "Don't forget to pack underwear and a toothbrush." Mrs. Norman comes downstairs. Her posture is remarkable. It's something she's worked on. She says to Mr. Norman, "How was your day?" Mr. Norman says, "What?" Mrs. Norman says, "Oh." She says, "How did you sleep?" Mr. Norman says, "There was an interesting program last night on the Great Wall of China. Turns out it's technically a hologram. It's the largest man-made hologram." Mrs. Norman says, "What do you mean by technically?" Mr. Norman says, "Do you mind if I turn up the birds?" Mrs. Norman says, "I dreamed that I found a turtle and I knew I had a CD stuck in him, but I couldn't figure out how to get it out. It was so frustrating because I knew the CD was inside there. It was that Mall Sonatas one I like so much. Inside the turtle." Matthew, the older boy, comes downstairs. Colorful sharks circle his pajamas and lunge at fat, lazy seals. He has cut off the sleeves, apparently with dull scissors or a knife. Mr. Norman checks the internet for the weather. He wants to check the weather on the television, too. He asks Matthew to turn the television to the weather network. Matthew sighs and says, "Which one?" Mr. Norman says, "The one on the staircase." Matthew says, "Not which television, which weather network." Mr. Norman says, "How many are there?" Matthew scowls. It's a difficult age. Or maybe something is wrong with him. Or maybe this is just normal. He says, "There's the Weather Network, and there's Weather Network Plus, and there's Extreme Weather." Mrs. Norman is sitting right-angled in the kitchen net nook, printing a course map and checking the weather on the internet. She says, "There's also Weather Europe." Mr. Norman says, "What's the difference?" Matthew says, "Weather Europe is not a part of our cable package." Curtis appears downstairs with a briefcase. Mrs. Norman says, "Cable package." Mr. Norman says, "Just put it on the Weather Network." Matthew says, "I've said it so many times and I'll say it again. The Weather Network Plus is better." Mr. Norman says, "Why is it better?" Matthew says, "What it is more up to the minute and complete." Mr. Norman says, "More complete than 24 hours a day?" Matthew says, "It has more weather." Mrs. Norman says,
I wonder why they even have the Weather Network anymore.
Curtis says,
Extreme Weather has this thing where they show you the weather from the weather's perspective. It looks awesome.
Mr. Norman says, put it on that Weather Network Plus. Matthew says, I have no idea what channel that is. Mrs. Norman, in the net nook, says,
Just a sec, I'll check our local cable listings for details.
Chapter 12, The Old Televisions, Part 2. The point being, watching television used to be a distinct and bounded activity, like bowling or extreme virtual snowboarding. You were not doing it, and then you were doing it. Likewise, you were doing it, and then you were not doing it. On, off, off, on. 0, 1. Binary. Simple, discrete, delineated. You turned it on to watch, and you turned it off when you were finished. When you were finished, you turned it off. Seems so strange now. That 1-inch heavy plastic border around the screen, everyone thought it was a non-permeable membrane. It would have been silly to suggest otherwise. But here's the thing. As the images on the screen kept getting brighter, sharper, clearer, the television set's plastic border kept getting fuzzier, blurrier, more ill-defined. The spilled images shimmered and danced in American parlors. Television became, gradually, non-discrete. Watching television became, gradually, non-binary. TV got tangled up in our lives, and there was no untangling. Our lives, which are on continuously until they are off. You don't turn a life on and off and on and off. Likewise with a TV, which is bound to life inseparably, inextricably. You wouldn't and couldn't turn it off even if you could. And you can't, because there is no off switch, because the televisions are built into the walls of homes, because they are in stores and restaurants, mounted in the corners above your booth, spilling pixels into your porridge. And, most of all, because they are there and on, even when they are not there. Did you ever see that one episode of American Nightmare where the insane guy wants to turn off his television? And there's no off switch and there's no cord to pull out? And he's going crazy, running around, screaming? It's spooky, kind of, but it's also hilarious. He's running around with this wild look, and finally he gets a gun and he stands in front of the big screen and he fires a shot right into it. And we're at floor level looking up at the screen, the crazy guy's screen, and we see it like explode, and we hear something fall to the ground, and then we see the crazy guy's foot twitching at the bottom right of our screen. Through our screen, we see his exploded screen and his foot. And when the cops come later, they find the guy on the floor with a single bullet through his head. That's a cool one. Chapter 13, Dew Point. Mr. Norman staring at the television on the staircase. Red arrows and blue arrows battle for meteorological supremacy. Clouds and decimal points race along coastlines. Happy yellow suns, happier and yellower than real suns, are scattered across a map. The suns have smiley faces, even though they are leaving burn marks in the earth. There is a thunderstorm warning, a heat advisory, a wind alert, a smog watch, a pollen alarm, a low-pressure trough, an Appalachian wedge, a hurricane stage 3. There is weather everywhere. Weather is assaulting this defenseless planet, and it's like nobody gives a damn. In the top right corner of the television is a small box tuned to a different channel. Picture in Picture. Extreme Weather's award-winning weathermentary Tsunami Survival. Slow motion footage of a piece of rice slicing through a car door. Mrs. Norman walks by. She says,
Interesting footage.
Damn right, it's unbelievable footage. We're talking never-before-seen footage. Mr. Norman is pretty interested in the footage, but there's Matthew staring, impassive, unimpressed. Something's not right. Sometimes Mr. Norman has the vague feeling that Matthew is gay. He thinks he would be okay with his son's homosexuality, just fine. When the time comes, he would like to have a talk with him. Mr. Norman might say, "Son, I'm straight, but not narrow." He would say, "Matty, hate is not a family value." He might add, "I'm glad we had this talk. Celebrate diversity." Mr. Norman says, "I think it's raining." Curtis, the younger boy, whose scholastic efforts have earned the Normans this trip to Las Vegas, a pudgy child, unathletic, unequivocally pro-bear, a good kid, friendly, outgoing, not much of a reader, a pretty decent Playmax Extreme Death Machine player, a pretty decent Playmax Extreme Deathmatch player, says, "What?" Mr. Norman says, "I think it's raining." To himself he adds, "Gay pride." Sedge Kellerman, the weather guy, says, "The bear index, BI, refers to how hot a bear would be at this temperature." Picture in picture. Asian youngsters whistling through a schoolyard like bullets. Pretty stock footage. Curtis says,
No, I was just outside putting the satellite dish on the sport utility vehicle. It's threatening, but it's not raining.
Mr. Norman says, "But look at this satellite photo." Mrs. Norman, up from the net nook, stares at the television on the staircase. She says,
That's a satellite photo of Finland.
Curtis, the younger boy, says,
Are they the Dutch?
Mr. Norman says, "What is barometric pressure?" Curtis says,
My teacher says the Dutch don't have a culture anymore. It's been taken away.
Matthew says, "What I'm asking you is who would want the Dutch culture?"
Curtis says, Her gardener is a Dutch and he's bitter and kind of hunched over and he says the culture has been sucked bloodless.
Mrs. Norman is so upright she's almost leaning backward. Sedge says, "It looks like clear weather today for our pilots. It's a good day for airstrikes, Chuck." Mrs. Norman says,
Barometric pressure is how hard the sky is pressing down on us.
Mr. Norman says, "But gravity is a constant. That's one of Newton's quips." The younger boy, Curtis, says,
It turns out that Newton may have really gotten. Oh, it turns out that Newton may not really have gotten an apple shot off of his head.
Mrs. Norman says,
Then what's the dew point?
Mr. Norman's older son, Matthew, says, "Wooden shoes and tulips and fjords? No thanks. You can have it." Chuck, Sedge's co-anchor on the TWN Plus morning shift, says, "Good luck, boys. Come home with your shield or on it." Mr. Norman says, "Turns out the record high for today is only 85. Matthew says, "Is that metric or what?"
Curtis says, I think that's Weather Europe, Dad.
Sedge Kellerman says, "Now back to Gale at the humidity desk." Mrs. Norman checks the internet. She says it turns out that the Dutch have worked hard to retain a thriving, vibrant culture. Chapter 14. Question and Answer Period. Upstairs, a bright-toothed, square-jawed young man in a hooded raincoat shares a split screen with a button-cute television personality. They're both going places. You can just see it. She, Lee Ann Cordero, says, "Let's check in with Trevor Fox out at the Singer or Outdoor Pavilion. Well, Trevor, looks like you need gills out there." All I want to know is, are these two doing it or not? He, Trevor Fox, that's with two X's, says, "Ha ha, that's right, Lee Ann." Lee Ann says,
Trevor, tell us what you've seen out there this morning. I mean, besides slanty rain.
Trevor Fox says, "Well, Leanne, an estimated crowd of 10,000 braved the wretched weather today to attend Reverend Marty Munson's special address here at the Singer Outdoor Pavilion. Reverend Munson, who was paroled last week, spoke for about an hour, primarily about the importance of faith in today's hectic world. He also urged people to send their prayers to the families of the mudslide victims in Mexico City and to the refugees in Illinois." Damn, you know they're doing it, and they deserve one another. Such beautiful people. Leanne Cordero says, "Trevor, did the Reverend appear to be in good health?" Trevor Fox smiles. Leanne Cordero says, "Trevor?" Trevor Fox smiles. Those teeth. Leanne Cordero says, "Trevor?" Trevor Fox turns to his right. He says, "Are we still on?" Leanne Cordero says, "We appear to be having what we in the business call technical difficulties." Trevor says, "I guess not." Leanne says, "We'll get this straightened out and get back to Trevor as soon as possible." Trevor says, "Gills, that's real funny. Barbie sits on her big ass in that studio while I'm in this goddamn monsoon. If I had cleavage like that, you think I'd keep getting passed over?" Maybe they were doing it at one time and are no longer doing it. Trevor shrugs and then peers into the monitor, tilting his head sideways. He says, "I wish I could grow sideburns. One side comes in fine, but the other side is like the fucking mange or something." Leanne says, "Thank you, Trevor, for that report." Trevor Fox looks back at the camera. He says, "Leanne?" Leanne says, "Trevor?" Trevor Fox says, "Leanne?" It's pretty obvious they still have feelings for one another. You can't help but pull for them. Trevor Fox says, "Leanne, in a question and answer period after Reverend Munson's talk, someone asked him if God is rooting for the bear or the shark. Reverend Munson drew a mixed and vocal response when he said that he had had plenty of time in the slammer to think about this question, and he had decided that God loves all of his creatures equally, but just maybe he loves bears a little more." Leanne says, "Interesting, Trevor." Trevor says, "Back to you, Leanne." Leanne says, "Thanks, Trevor, and go get yourself some hot soup." Chapter 15. Bear v. Shark, the breakfast cereal. Family vacation. Big day. It's important to start your day off, right. If you can't have a nutritious breakfast, then at least have something that is an important part of one. The Normans all together, except for maybe one of the kids, sitting at the kitchen table in front of a television like families used to. Dan Rockwell print here. The kid outside is at the edge of the lawn, pretending to juggle 4 sharp objects. Chocolate waffle bears, chewy caramel sharks, and little marshmallows in the shape of lawyers, guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money. The shit has hit the fan. Warren Zevon, ladies and gentlemen. Chocolate waffle bears, chewy caramel sharks, and little marshmallows in the shapes of lawyers, guns, and money. Shark Pup Scratch and Sniff in specially marked boxes. The cereal box, specially marked, says, "Now available in family size and today's hectic world size." The cereal box says, "Kids love the taste. Adults love the mid-morning competitive advantage that it confers." The cereal box says, "Did you hear the one about the foolhardy mouse who clicked on a sleeping bear? Punchline inside." The cereal box says, "Provides 75% of your daily nougat and 100% of your daily fun." The cereal box says, "Warning, pregnant women should not eat the marshmallows." The cereal box says, "Test your knowledge of bears and sharks with this fun true or false quiz." The cereal box says, "Wallace might have beaten Darwin to it if he'd only had an entertaining and nutritious breakfast." The cereal box says, "Visit our website." The cereal box says, "Free pager inside." The cereal box says, 10 simple things you can do to cut down on mass starvation." Mrs. Norman says,
Well, I guess we should get the car loaded.
the punchline, inside, says, the bear didn't get mad, he got even. He waited until the mouse and his family were all asleep inside their den, and then he burst in and opened fire, killing everyone. Sweet revenge. The television says Bear v. Shark cereal is the official cereal of Bear v. Shark 2. One of the boys says the way he heard it was that the bear hacked the mouse family up with one of those curvy bladed Grim Reaper type deals. Machete? No, a scythe. Give me 1 sec here. I didn't think we'd get through that bit so fast. So I am. There we go. Just rearranging here. A little bit. Okay. Chapter 16 Lucky Marble. The Normans load the Sport Utility Vehicle, SUV. There is no rain. The morning sky is sky blue. Bloated, billowy clouds float gently across the sky like dead fish in a lake. The sky is not so much blue as it is brown. Someone says, cumulative clouds. Someone says, calamari olives, tubal litigation, ulterior motif. Curtis says,
That one looks like a derringer.
Matthew turns his head sideways and stares at the bloated fish clouds. He says, it looks more like a battle axe to me.
Curtis says, No, not that one. Over here. See the harpoon? It's just to the left of that.
Matthew says, whatever. Mrs. Norman checks the thermometer on the side of the house.
She says, Golly, no wonder it's so hot.
The E-Atlas says it's 812 miles to Las Vegas. It recommends that the Normans take 2 days to get there, Thursday and Friday, which gives them much of Saturday to see the sights in what is often referred to as the world's most amusing country. The big show is Saturday night at the Darwin Dome, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. Pacific. 6 p.m. Pacific. The E-Atlas recommends that the Normans visit the world's largest billboard, the world's funnest virtual water park, and the world's original gambling monkey, all of which are located within the Museum of Las Vegas Secession. The families in the house on each side of the Norman's house gather at curtained, pressure-treated windows to peek out high and low at the lucky American family next door. Think about it. It could have been us. What's so special about the Normans? It should have been us. Damn it, why can't our family go to Las Vegas to be healed and entertained? The disappointments in this life just stack up. Mr. Norman looks at his front yard. He thinks it is beginning to crack, chip, and peel. He thinks it is beginning to flake and fade. It is not a healthy lawn. He hoists suitcases into the SUV. He says, How did you get the CD out? Mrs. Norman says,
What?
Mr. Norman, his dental work tingling and popping with colorless, odorless waves of data, says, Your dream, the turtle, the CD. A man's sign says, Down on luck. Can you spare any change? God bless. Mrs. Norman says,
Oh, yes.
Mr. Norman says, How did you get the CD out of the turtle? Curtis walks over to the other kid on the lawn. The kid's name is Lloyd, and he lives 5 houses down, and he's not really like the other kids. His front yard was once orange for a few days before the threatening letters, the midnight calls, the broken windows. It's green now. Mrs. Norman says,
Oh, it was the damnedest thing. I had to take an ice pick and smash the turtle's shell.
Lloyd says,
Hi, Curtis.
Curtis says,
Hi, Lloyd.
Lloyd is pretending to jump rope. Occasionally, the imaginary rope catches his foot, and he says, "Darn," or "For Pete's sake," and he begins again. Lloyd says,
Do you have your passport ready?
Curtis says,
I don't know.
Lloyd says,
My mother won't let me play Bear v. Shark.
Curtis says,
Everyone knows.
Lloyd says,
She thinks it's dumb and violent.
Curtis says,
It's just for fun.
Lloyd practices the foxtrot, smirking coyly at an invisible partner. Curtis says,
Is she plotting its downfall?
Lloyd says,
She's not plotting anything. She never comes outside anymore.
Curtis says,
Everyone knows.
Lloyd winks and says,
The pleasure is all mine.
Curtis says,
Is she crazy?
Lloyd stops dancing. His small sneakers have too many stripes to be the right kind. Way too many. His shirt is terry cloth. He says,
Maybe.
Matthew says, Curtis, get over here and help. Lloyd says,
My mom told me to come here and tell you to be careful.
Curtis says,
Me?
Lloyd does a crisp cartwheel on the lawn, and then another one. He says,
Yes, she said to be very careful.
Matthew says, Come on, butthole. Curtis has been in and out of plenty of dangerous situations, and he's got the calluses on his gaming thumb to prove it. He says,
Nobody gets hurt in Bear v. Shark, Lloyd.
Lloyd does a magic trick and holds out his open hand to Curtis. There's a small glassy ball in his palm. Curtis says,
At school, when our class voted, it was tied. 14 bear votes and 14 shark votes.
Lloyd says,
Curtis, do you want my lucky marble?
Curtis says,
But there are 29 of us in class.
Lloyd says,
You should take it.
Curtis says,
You didn't vote, did you?
Matthew throws a stick at Curtis. Curtis says,
Bye, Lloyd.
and walks back to the driveway. The driveway is painted black. Lloyd takes off toward home, on either a pretend horse or a pretend motorcycle. Matthew says, His mom is totally crazy. Curtis says,
Hey, Matt, what's a marble?
Chapter 17, The Last Folk Singer. Meanwhile, the last folk singer and the last folk singer's dog climb into their beat-up van and point it toward Las Vegas. The last folk singer is tired. His guitar says, This machine kills fake animals. While he drives, the last folk singer opens his fan mail. One letter says,
If I were you, I wouldn't step 1 foot across the border, you pinko shithead.
Another letter in blue crayon says,
You're going to be dead, fucker.
Woody's got his head out the window. He's licking the wind, ears pinned back, eyes all squinty. Another letter says,
1. You are useless. 2. This is America. 3. I hate you.
The last folk singer closes the mailbag and takes a harmonica from his shirt pocket and plays Rambling BVS Blues number 8, one hand on the wheel. The way station is closed, the left lane ends, the speeding fines are doubled in a work zone. Woody turns 3 times on the ripped vinyl bench seat, sighs, and puts his big yellow lab head on the last folk singer's lap. His brow looks kind of furrowed and worried the way a dog's can. Chapter 18. Mr. and Mrs. Norman checking the house one last time. Some of the red oh sorry. Some of the little red lights are flashing and some are not. Everything seems okay. What exactly are hatches and how does one batten them down? A phone rings.
Hello.
Mr. Norman.
Yes,
How are you today?
I'm happy with my long-distance service.
And yet,
I'm afraid I have to go. I'm on my way out the door.
I know.
What?
Mr. Norman, you don't really care who wins, do you?
Who is this?
One of you.
I'm happy with my internet service provider.
It's not really important, is it? The outcome.
Who is this? I've got to go.
Mr. Norman, have you ever heard of Teletown?
Of course.
What do you know about it?
Everyone knows about Teletown. It's the scenic bivouac featured on so many postcards and calendars and screensavers.
There's more.
Gypsies live there and make cookies. There are a million TVs, with more arriving all the time.
You don't know everything about Teletown.
I don't really know what a bivouac is.
Just know that we're out here.
Who? Where? What are you selling?
Travel well.
Wait!
Yes?
Help me.
What?
I'm happy with my car insurance.
Goodbye.
Mrs. Norman says,
Who was that?
Mr. Norman says,
A mysterious caller.
Mrs. Norman says,
Well, what did they want?
Mr. Norman says,
That is exactly what I don't know.
Chapter 19. A dead mouse is still a mouse. The Normans of America aren't even out of their suburban driveway when Curtis, the younger of the two boys, starts talking from the back of the sport utility vehicle, SUV, about this couple that had a baby even though the woman had been in prison a long time, but the husband had met her on a conjurer visit, and they cut holes in their jeans and hid from the security cameras in the visiting room. Mr. Norman, driving, says,
Jesus.
he is mildly aroused. The part about the holes in the jeans. Mrs. Norman, front passenger side, says,
That's conjugal visit, Curtis.
Curtis says,
What did I say?
Mr. Norman, neck cradled in the Vibra Dream Plus, says,
You said jugular visit.
Curtis says,
Oh, well, that's what they said on the television.
Mr. Norman says,
They said jugular visit on the television?
Curtis says,
Yeah, on the prison network.
Mr. Norman says,
Huh.
Mrs. Norman, feet resting flat on the floor, shoulder width apart, says,
No, honey, you said conjurer visit.
Curtis says,
I could have sworn I said jugular.
Mrs. Norman says,
And I don't really want you talking about prison sex back there.
somewhere nearby something explodes, rattling the futuristic cup holders in the sport utility vehicle. Somewhere nearby someone screams. Curtis says,
Well, that's just what they said on the television.
Mr. Norman says,
Gosh, people do find a way, don't they?
Mrs. Norman says,
Larry.
the Normans, husband and wife, have not slept in the same bed in some time. Mr. Norman sleeps not well. Mrs. Norman has turned to posture. They met somewhere and they fell in love, and they both just knew it was right. And there were nights, weren't there nights, all coiled up with their silly, tender jokes and their fingers tracing faces, the ruined sheets, the smell of their bodies, the ache and shimmer of the future, some clock somewhere chiming 3, then 4 on a weeknight. Curtis says something, and then Matthew says something. There were nights, his lips on the pulse of her neck, whispering sweetheart, let's make love in every state of the Union, and Vegas too. Sweetheart, I want to memorize you. It wasn't a movie. It may have happened. It wasn't a movie. Mr. Norman drives the sport utility vehicle through neighborhoods lined with splendid trees, their thick trunks columned in classical decay, their black leafless branches like skeleton fingers reaching over the oily streets. It always seemed like her hair, Mrs. Norman's hair, got curlier while she slept. In the morning, a beautiful mess.
Mr. Norman says, "What kind of trees, boys?"
A quiz. The boys say, "Dead."
Mr. Norman says, "Aha, but a dead mouse is still a mouse."
Mrs. Norman says,
It's all this heat.
Mr. Norman says, "I thought it was all those chemicals in the ground."
Matthew says,
"I thought it was the Dutch Lyme disease."
Mrs. Norman says,
Well, yes, but it's the heat that makes the chemicals so bad. It's a symbiotic relationship.
she, the cordless vibrating pillow, says, "You, sir, are a fantastic driver." Matthew says to Curtis, his younger brother,
"Conjurer visit?"
Matthew says,
"You a moron."
Curtis says,
You!
they met and fell in love. He had never seen anyone ski like that. A woman skimming across the top of water will melt your heart. A woman with tan arms and her own life vest will make you forget all the others. Matthew says,
"You a dick sandwich."
Curtis says,
You're the dick sandwich!
Matthew says,
"I don't need this from you, bear hugger."
Mrs. Norman says,
It's penis, boys, and that's enough.
Matthew says,
"You don't even have an idea what a penis sandwich is."
Curtis says,
I do too.
Mr. Norman says,
"Neither do I."
he, our hero, steers the burgundy sport utility vehicle, SUV, around the entrance ramp and onto the freeway, weaving a slalom course around the scorched black husks of burned out American sedans with power windows and anti-lock brakes. The Normans are on their way. Chapter 20. And now this.
Tom, just where did the Bear v. Shark mania originate?
Well, Mindy, a lot of ink and even some blood have been spilled trying to answer precisely that question. It just so happens that there is a bitter, long-standing, and litigious dispute involving the origins of America's favorite pastime.
Could you elaborate, Tom?
Sure, Mindy. In essence, some believe the bear v. shark question to be a very old one. Recently, a medievalist at Columbia produced a fragment of a text that he believes was written by a little-known French philosopher and theologian in the 11th century. The author of the fragment is essentially scoffing at the intense debate generated over a question that is, he believes, a no-brainer, to use the modern parlez-vous. Mindy, it appears this little French monk was quite the bear man. Mindy laughs. Her bone structure is exquisite. Her ex-boyfriend Nate lost big money on Bear v. Shark 1. The text in translation reads, "And yet why is this a matter that must perplex us all so? The bear is angry and really strong. The shark has enough teeth, certainly, for a single mouth, but in its fins we see frailty and, in essence, a smallness of spirit."
So, Tom, the question goes back at least to the medieval period.
Well, Mindy, there has been some doubt about the authenticity of the fragment. In fact, at the recent annual conference of a prominent scholarly organization, one speaker went so far as to publicly denounce the fragment as a hoax, which stirred up a bit of a fracas in the ivory tower. Mindy, according to one report, a retired Aquinas expert was inadvertently gouged in the eyeball during the scuffle.
That's interesting, Tom. Any other ideas about where this whole craze may have started?
As a matter of fact, Mindy, others have argued that Bear v. Shark is older yet, that it is, in essence, of ancient Eastern origin. Some would have it that Bear v. Shark is essentially a variation on a Buddhist koan, or a paradoxical riddle presented to Zen students to help them break free of reason and, in essence, achieve enlightenment.
Kind of like a brain teaser, Tom.
Essentially, yes. But while there is undoubtedly a beguiling, meditative, even spiritual quality
to the question, there is also scant evidence that bear v. shark is Zen.
Well then, Tom, what about Darwin's famous quip?
Mindy, experts can find no evidence to support the widely circulated story that Darwin once remarked to Huxley, "If the indolent and bumbling bear but put yet a scratch on the awful shark, I will verily eat my hat." In essence, the story appears to be made up.
So where does that leave us, Tom?
Well, folks who study the matter are essentially in agreement that the bear v. shark problem, as it is now generally stated, who would win in a fight between a bear and a shark, is not ancient or medieval or even Victorian, but in fact dates back, in essence, to no more than 8 or 10 years.
Is that right?
Ever since an enterprising young man named Elton Thigpen patented the bear v. shark question 5 years ago and then sold it to Hard Corp for 11 million, no fewer than 250 people have come forward to claim that they were, in essence, the ones to invent the modern day cone. Of these, some 75 have brought lawsuits.
Against Mr. Thigpen?
Essentially, yes, and also against Hard Corp and each other.
I see. When will the madness end, Tom?
Well, Mindy, certainly not before the showdown on August 18th, when, as they say, the land will meet the sea in Las Vegas.
And is there any talk of a rubber match if the bear should win this time around, Tom?
Mindy, you can never rule out a rematch.
Thanks, Tom. Stay tuned. The Zinger's coming up with your weekend forecast. Plus, we'll catch you up to speed on that horrible passenger train disaster last night. So things in this America are great, as you can see. Chapter 21. In the Lord all things are possible. The trip odometer says 111, and the digital clock on the sport utility vehicle dashboard says 112. I think you see the possibilities here. Mr. Norman accelerates out of cruise control. He is searching for something real, like when Mrs. Norman used to lick his teeth when they kissed. Was it his teeth? Was it her tongue? Was it on TV? Something got licked, something got bit. It was good, and so long ago. Mrs. Norman says, "What are you doing?"
Mr. Norman says, "I'm trying to get the trip odometer and the clock to match up." He says, "I think that would be neat."
Mrs. Norman says, "Neat?"
Mr. Norman says, "Pleasing."
He keeps on accelerating, swerving to the shoulders to pass slower cars, oil fires, dead dogs, hobos. He says,
"Meaningful."
The Vibradream Plus says,
"Yes. No. Yes."
Mrs. Norman tenses, and her posture becomes even better than it had been before, and it had been very good. She says, "Well, we could just reset the clock to match the odometer." This is Mr. Norman's life partner? Reset the clock and odometer? How does this come to be, this chasm, this gulf in sensibility? Could you even feel it if someone licked your teeth? Mr. Norman says,
"But then we wouldn't have earned it."
He jerks the wheel, pulling onto the dusty, sun-scorched median to pass a school bus with a shark painted the length of its side. The shark is wearing a purple satin robe with gold letters. The satin robe says, "In the Lord all things are possible." On the tail of the shark, some okay. On the tail of the shark, some bearerist has spray painted "Fluke." Mrs. Norman says, "Earned what?" Mr. Norman, licking his top front teeth, says,
"The meaning."
The trip odometer says 112. Mr. Norman says,
"Hey, we did it! Look here, boys."
The boys, asleep, are asleep, wearing sunglasses and headphones. Matthew has a baseball hat on with triangular teeth on the bill and gill slits on the sides. That is one mean-looking cap. The 9-inch television, TV, is on the floor, pointed upward. The extreme weather guy, former war correspondent, says,
This is what the fog actually sees.
it's a safe bet that Matthew would have been nonchalant about his dad's feat. It might have reminded Curtis of something else really cool and recent. The clock says 1:13. Mr. Norman says, shoot. He slows down and resets the cruise control. Mrs. Norman says,
But you did it, honey.
Mr. Norman says,
They did match up there for a few seconds.
another fan letter in the bottom of the last folk singer's mailbag says,
If you think you were treated shabbily at BVS on ice, just you wait.
Mrs. Norman says,
And you earned it, too.
Mr. Norman says,
Funny thing is, I still didn't feel much of anything.
Chapter 22. The Old Televisions, Part 3. People used to come home from a hard day's work and sit with bad posture in front of the television and just flip and flip and flip. All night long, flipping past channels showing junk that they didn't want to watch. The remote. Some people say clicker. Some say driver or wand. At my house, we said phaser. And sure, I remember a time when we changed those suckers by hand. They knew they were missing something. They wanted something better. Hundreds of channels, but most of them were unsuited for a specific viewer's quirky, eccentric individual tastes. They knew they wanted to be watching television, but they weren't really enjoying it. Flip, flip, flip. Then along came ESP TV, the TV that knows you. You, the one that reads your mind. From a comprehensive main menu, you program up to 38 general topics of personal interests, GTPI, racket sports, vegetable gardening, medium soft porn, antique roadshows, and ESP TV shows you what you want to see. Don't like classic automobiles or starving African children? Well, you never have to see them again. Ever. Well, yes, and a patented censor that senses when the viewer is bored or dissatisfied. Today's TVs flip themselves, move on, find the ideal programming, and find it fast. Those old ESP TV infomercials are classics now, the woman in the sequined bikini smashing the remote control with a sledgehammer. The clicker, Roger, is a thing of the past, just like the waffle iron and the novel.
And just like viewer dissatisfaction, Buzz.
Chapter 23. 10-second debate. Mr. Norman drives. Las Vegas is still far away. The topless women, the cheap buffets, the hotel lobby aquariums, the happy songs of the slots. And the bear and the shark, realer than life, grappling while a nation holds its breath and its lottery tickets. Neil Postman says,
Ignorance is always correctable, but what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge?
everything will be fine. In Las Vegas, everything will be made right. The spectacle transforms. It redeems. Mr. Norman turns on the radio. An FM frequency modulation gangster says,
My bitch left so fast she left skid marks.
Mr. Norman hits the scan button. A trustworthy sounding guy says, If you're sick and tired of the nutbag babblers on those other stations, turn your dial to Smash 94, the Babble Blockin' Rocker. We don't talk, we just play the extreme light rock that we know you want to hear. Mr. Norman hits the scan button. An excited guy says,
Hernia soda for a taste so heavy you'll need a spotter.
Mr. Norman hits the scan button. The suspect's neighbor says,
He seemed like just a regular guy. He kept to himself mostly.
Mr. Norman hits the AM, ante-meridium button. A crooner, old white guy, croons. Mr. Norman hits the scan button. A moderator says, "Welcome to 10-second debate. Today's topic, abortion. The position of opening remark has been established by coin toss. Ready, debaters? Okay, go!" A shaper of public opinion, Helen, says,
Freedom means choice, Rick.
A think tank member, Rick, says,
It's a child, not a choice, Helen.
Helen says,
If you can't trust me with a choice, etc., Rick.
Rick says,
Abortion, Helen, stops a beating heart.
Helen says,
Against abortion, Rick, don't have one.
Rick says,
Helen, ever seen one of those little fetuses they suck out of there?
the moderator rings a bell and says, "Okay, there you have it. Our thanks to Rick Higgins and Helen Glass." Helen says,
Rick, keep your laws off my body.
Mr. Norman can't quite figure out how he feels about abortion. There are so many different points of view. Rick says,
Shut up, Helen.
Mr. Norman scans until he lands on Bear v. Shark. Bear v. Shark Talk Radio.
Oh, I like this, Mrs. Norman says. It's always so interesting.
Mr. Norman says, "It's a forum."
Mrs. Norman says, It's the Greek ideal of participatory democracy.
Mr. Norman says, "Town meeting."
Mrs. Norman says, Global village.
Mr. Norman says, "Fiber optics." In the back seat, Curtis, the younger boy, a nice enough kid, shifts in his sleep and says,
Virtual summit.
Chapter 24, Bear v. Shark, Talk Radio. The energetic, deep-voiced host of Bear v. Shark Talk Radio says, "We're back and we have with us Dr. Sarah Meredith, a professor of animal violence and habits and the author of the controversial book, The Fin Factor. Thanks for being here, Dr. Meredith." Dr. Meredith says,
Thank you for having me, Wild Simon.
Wild Simon says, "Time for our next caller. This is Wayne in Roanoke, Virginia. Thanks for calling, Wayne. What's your question for Dr. Meredith?" Wayne says,
I love your show, man.
Wild Simon says, "Thanks, Wayne." Dr. Meredith says,
Hi, Wayne.
Wayne says, "Hi." Wild Simon says, "Your question, Wayne?" Wayne says,
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say the shark is gonna kick ass.
Wild Simon says, "Okay, thanks, Wayne." Matthew says, "Which is what I've been saying for how long now?" Wild Simon says, "Well, Dr. Meredith, isn't that pretty much what you're arguing in the Fin Factor?" Dr. Meredith says,
In a small nutshell, yes.
Wild Simon says, "Because of the fins?" Dr. Meredith says,
What?
Wild Simon says, "The shark will win because of the fins?" Dr. Meredith says,
Yes, it's my thinking that entirely too much attention has been paid to the teeth.
Mrs. Norman visualizes her spine as a tree trunk, like they say to. Wild Simon says, "There are many rows and they are very sharp. When one falls out, two more grow back. They cut right through bone and metal." Dr. Meredith sighs. She says,
Right.
Wild Simon says, "Doesn't fin mean something in French?" Dr. Meredith says,
Yes.
Wild Simon says, "What do you make of that?" Dr. Meredith says,
I haven't really thought much about it.
Wild Simon says, "Okay, this is Tina in the Bronx. You're on, Tina." Tina says,
Our English word berserk comes from the ancient Scandinavian belief that if a warrior put on a bearskin shirt called a bear sock that had been covered in oils and herbs, he would take on the power of the bear. It is said that these Viking warriors became frenzied and could literally eat through their enemy's armor, and also they could catch on fire and not really be harmed much.
Wild Simon says,
Tina, do you have a question for Dr. Meredith?
Wild Simon says,
Tina?
Mr. Norman feels happy. Not happy exactly, but safe and warm and drowsy. The warm, safe lull of the voices. Wild Simon says,
Dr. Meredith, I heard somewhere that you've had death threats.
Dr. Meredith says, yes, that's true. Wild Simon says,
Well, it could be worse. People could be indifferent.
Dr. Meredith says, I guess so. Wild Simon says,
You know, there was this great race car driver, Richard Petty or somebody, and the fans were getting on him, you know. The race fans were booing him good, and a reporter or someone asked Petty or whoever, you know, what does all that booing ever bother you? And you know what he said?
Dr. Meredith says, is Richard Petty still racing? Wild Simon says,
He said, hey, at least they're making noise.
Dr. Meredith says, noise is never bad. Wild Simon says,
Are these threats from bear people?
Dr. Meredith says, yes, and from some shark people who don't think fins are all that important. Wild Simon says,
It's a crazy world out there.
Dr. Meredith, author of The Fin Factor, says, most of the people I've met have been lovely. Wild Simon says,
Time for one more caller. This is our old friend Dale in Houston. Hi, Dale. Welcome back. What's your question for Dr. Meredith?
Dale says, hello? Wild Simon says,
You're on, Dale. 20 seconds left.
Dr. Meredith says, hi, Dale. Curtis says, Houston is windier than so-called Chicago. That is what it says. Houston is windier than so-called Chicago. Dale says, people root for the bear 'cause it looks like us. It has ears and arms and eyes. The whole bear faction is just ethnocentric because bears are like humans. We're both vertebrates. Dr. Meredith says, sharks are vertebrates too, Dale. Dale, in Houston, says, well, we're both mammals. Wild Simon says,
Isn't a shark a mammal too?
Dr. Meredith says, you're thinking of bats. Dale says, a shark's not a mammal because it doesn't have a pouch or hairy young. Wild Simon says,
Dale, do you have a question for Dr. Meredith?
Dale says, I'd like to say hi to Rusty and Bingo in Galveston. Wild Simon says,
Thanks for calling, Dale.
Matthew says, it's like I hate Dale. Dr. Meredith says, bye, Dale. Chapter 25 Dutch Treat. Is Dutch elm disease technically Dutch? What do you mean by technically? Oh, sorry, these are two different voices.
Is Dutch elm disease technically Dutch?
What do you mean by technically?
Is the elm Dutch or the disease or both?
It's an example of what they refer to essentially as an unclear moderator.
Like a large animal clinic?
Like dirty book publisher.
Like small television room?
Like red wine glass.
Like thick juicy steaks?
No.
What about Dutch uncle?
You can't say Dutch uncle anymore. That's like calling somebody a dwarf. They like to be called little people.
Dutch uncles want to be called little people?
You can't say Dutch courage anymore either because that's offensive to drunk people.
How about Dutch oven?
That's okay.
Dutch door?
Fine.
Dutch Guiana?
We say Suriname now.
Dutch cheese, Dutch auction, or Dutch clover, Dutchman's breeches, Dutch colonial?
All okay.
Dutch treat?
Oh, the flaming dessert.
No, you're thinking of bananas Florentine.
So as you can say, this book is as you can see, I am getting more dyslexic with the week, I swear. As you can see, this book is a madhouse. It's completely berserk. It does not care about traditional forms and pacing. It doesn't. And that's okay. Chapter 26 The cockfights ain't pipin'. A public service announcement, PSA, from Jasper Pallas, the voice of Uncle Jaws on the Tuesday night situational comedy, The Sharkleys.
Rise up, Jas Palace here, and this is a big bullhorn to all the pre-adults out there. Hey, we all know how much funny fun bears and sharks are, right? Jam on toast, mes enfants. But hear me out, you teen machines. There is a flip to the up. A bear or a shark can also be a very serious and even life-threatening matter. Last year alone, 16 people were killed. That's 16 corpses, my deputy dogs. Dozens were injured, and hundreds more were arrested when they tried to take American-style fun and entertainment into their own felonious, no-thinking hands. Use your lobe, kids. Leave the bear v shark scrap to the computer tie guys. If someone you know wants to get a hold of one of these beastie beasts or arrange a real fight, just walk away. Show 'em your bakery. See, the cockfights ain't pipin'. And parents, it's never too early to talk to your kids about the dangers of obtaining live bears and sharks or pitting them against each other in a real duel. Zip! Let's keep bear v shark safe, fun, and lawful. Yes, ma'am. Freaky frack, hypes. See you on Tuesday nights.
Chapter 27. Planet Peanut Brittle. Don't forget about the Normans. They're taking a trip to Las Vegas. They're making good time, too, by the looks of the billboards and retail centers whizzing past. Sometimes you have to tear down a big store and put a bigger one where the big one used to be. The bigger store holds more stuff. The family has traveled 194 American miles, and Mr. Norman knows it. A billboard says, "Exit now for Planet Peanut Brittle." There is a picture of a guy in a spacesuit walking across lumpy brown candy, giving a thumbs up to mission control. The image is somehow both futuristic and nostalgic. Janus-faced. It's the sticky treat for the new millennium, but it's also the irresistible snack you remember as a child. The aftertaste of time. Our special ingredient is memory. Those PR wizards, they've done what nobody thought they could do. They've dusted off peanut brittle, updated it, refurbished it, made it appropriate for today's hectic world. It's not your granny's recipe. It's PB2K. They've made peanut brittle timeless, cross-generational. Peanut brittle is back, more relevant than ever. Exit now. Mr. Norman exits. It's good to be spontaneous on a trip. Mrs. Norman is playing an electronic knitting game. The way you win is to make a scarf or an afghan or a turtleneck sweater, except it's not a real sweater you can wear. There is a cross-stitch cartridge, too, and one called Darning Mania. Mrs. Norman says,
Where are you going?
"Brittle sticks, brittle logs, brittle rings." Mr. Norman says,
I thought we'd get some peanut brittle.
Matthew says,
What I'm saying is just try getting it out of your bicuspids.
Mrs. Norman looks up from her knitting game. She's on Mittens level. There is the sound of a clock, and then the sound of smashing glass. Game over. With knitting, you hesitate, you die. Mrs. Norman says,
Larry, you know I'm allergic to peanut brittle. It makes my tongue swell up.
Mr. Norman says, What? Mrs. Norman says,
You know that.
Mr. Norman parks the SUV in the spacious parking lot of Planet Peanut Brittle. There's a guy with a fin taped to his back handing out coupons. Mr. Norman says,
Well, we'll get the kind without peanuts.
Mrs. Norman says,
No, it's the brittle that makes me so sick. I'm allergic to the brittle. I'm fine with peanuts.
Mr. Norman turns off the car but keeps both hands on the wheel. He's staring straight ahead. Sometimes he gets so tired. He says,
You've always been allergic?
Mrs. Norman says,
Something in the brittle. My tongue just fills my mouth.
Curtis says,
Let's see, Mom.
Mrs. Norman says,
It was a nice thought, though.
It's brittle-rific. Mrs. Norman says,
Let's go ahead and get some lunch while we're stopped.
Matthew says,
Hey, how many bears does it take to screw in a light bulb?
was Mrs. Norman a graceful water skier? Where is her birthmark and what is its shape? What really funny thing did she do when she was 5? Does she like the pulp in her orange juice? Where was the honeymoon? What is the feel of your naked belly pressed against someone else's? Quick, what grade is Matthew in? How is Curtis doing in school? Do the other kids like him? Just who are these people in the car with Mr. Norman, and what makes their tongues swell? It's 618 miles to Las Vegas, but then what? A bear, a shark, a level playing field. Mr. Norman rests his head on the steering wheel. He says,
5.
Chapter 28, Darwin Dome. Here's what happened, essentially. Hardcorp told Las Vegas that if the city didn't build a 65,000-seat arena for Bear v. Shark 2, Red in Tooth and Claw, the big show would move elsewhere. The corporation had gotten plenty of nice offers from other cities, including Los Angeles and Buffalo and Miami. Vegas officials crunched the numbers and figured out that the city could tear down 3 casinos, build the Darwin Dome for the big event, then tear down the dome and rebuild the casinos, and still come out in the black. Done deal, technically. The best tickets went to executives, politicians, military officers, movie stars, professional athletes and wrestlers, TV personalities, foreign dignitaries, puppet despots, models, gangsters, and game show hosts. 15,000 tickets were available through a lottery. Over 21 million, 21 with 6 zeros after it, people entered the lottery, and the lucky winners were given the opportunity to buy 2 tickets for $2,500 each. You win the lottery you enter the lottery for the opportunity to spend $2,500.
Ah, capitalism, it's lovely.
A handful of tickets were given away in specially marked boxes of C and Lee meat snacks. Void where prohibited. Check package for details. And 4 tickets were given to the family of the winner of a national essay contest open to elementary school students. Students were to write a 250-word response to the question, what does Bear v. Shark mean to America? Curtis Norman of America, who had gotten chubby on C and Lee meat snacks, won the essay contest. Chapter 29, Some Jokes. How many bears does it take to screw in a light bulb? How many? 5. 1 to screw in the bulb and 4 to pick sharks' teeth out of their asses.
Knock, knock. Who's there? Bear. Bear who? Bear with me while I kick this shark's ass.
An invisible bear goes to see the doctor and sits in the waiting room. The receptionist, who just happens to be a shark, says to the invisible bear,
I'm sorry, the doctor can't see you right now.
Why did the chicken cross the road? To get a better look at the bear or shark ripping off the shark's or bear's head and feasting on its entrails.
Hey, do you know what they used to call the internet when it first became available?
I give up.
Get this, the information superhighway.
Chapter 30, Ethos. The sign says, Ma's Old-Fashioned Interstate Tavern. Another sign says, Bear and Shark lottery tickets sold here. Another sign says, if you can barely stand the heat, then shark your car and come on in. Mrs. Norman says, this looks good. The hostess says,
4 for lunch.
she, the hostess, says,
Smoking or non-smoking?
4 for lunch. She, the hostess, says,
Smoking or non-smoking?
she says,
Internet access?
The Normans follow the paw prints on the tile floor to their booth. Mr. Norman wonders what might be the best way to kill yourself. He saw it on a television program. It was a contest. Mrs. Norman asks the waitress if Ma's old-fashioned interstate tavern bear burger is really made out of bear or if that's just a cute name like the Sharka Colada. Sharka Colada, sorry. The waitress says,
I'll go check.
a pop singer says, baby, 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 baby. Thoreau says, we are in great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas. There is a television mounted to the wall above the Norman's booth. A reporter is on some busy city street, interviewing passerby. It might be New Orleans, maybe Lansing. Matthew plays handheld bear killer. The game says, beep, beep, grrr. He, Matthew, says,
I saw on the internet that people get real bears and sharks to fight.
Mrs. Norman says,
Yes, I read about that. They're called cockfights.
Curtis, the youngest boy, raised on sugar substitute and embedded chips and digital enhancement, says,
What?
Mrs. Norman says,
They're called that because male sharks and male bears are known as cocks.
Curtis says,
What do they call the women?
Mr. Norman stares at the television. You could jump off something high, for instance. He says,
They say the shark almost always wins.
Matthew pokes Curtis in the neck. He says,
See?
Curtis says,
Ow!
the pop singer says,
Oh yeah, don't you feel it, baby?
the waitress says,
It's just the normal hamburger.
Mrs. Norman says,
So it's made from a cow?
the waitress, who sometimes cries for no apparent reason and who answers strongly agree to the question, often posed on psychological evaluations, do you often have feelings of despair or hopelessness, says,
I'll go check.
Bear Killer says, tick, 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 tick. Time is running out. See, if you don't find the bear den, infiltrate it, and kill all 3 cubs with a big rock in a certain amount of time, the mother bear comes home and gores you with a halberd. The guy in the booth next to the Norman says,
I saw one cockfight website that said the bear picked up the shark over his head and threw it into the audience, injuring 5.
Curtis says,
Fricky frack, hypes!
Matthew says,
Yeah, but the same website also said that the bear shouted, I vanquish thee, as he threw the shark, which I doubt very seriously he did.
Thoreau says, but Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate. Mr. Norman looks down from the television at the guy in the next booth over. The guy's eyes look funny. The guy keeps glancing at Mr. Norman and making quick jerking motions with his head. Towards something, the dessert case or the restrooms or the Zoloft smoothie kiosk or ZSK. Imagine, if you will, in a world where there is a Zoloft smoothie kiosk.
Curtis says, The internet raises some thorny issues about credibility and ethos.
Everyone looks at Curtis, this pre-adult, this virtual madman. At his keyboard he has taken countless lives. Ain't no thing. He has received outrageous sexual favors from cyber whores with tits out to here. Digital fucking machines born to pleasure Curtis Norman. Matthew, to Curtis, says,
Shut up, fag.
Mr. Norman knows that you would want to wait until after Bear v. Shark 2, of course. You could electrocute yourself easily enough, it seems. There's electricity everywhere. A woman on the television clutching a bag of groceries tells the reporter that sharks are, like, 90% teeth. Curtis says,
It was on the internet. Some professor had a website. He turned out not to be a professor, just a fisherman who reads a lot, but I think his point about ethos still holds.
The waitress says,
It's mostly cow.
The Normans order bear burgers and sharky temples for the kids. Curtis says,
Can you pass the sugar substitute?
a guy on the television wearing a bike helmet and a blood-soaked shirt says that bears are as fast as cougars. Matthew says,
What you have to remember is that a person who reads the Sunday New York Times gets more information than a French villager in the 18th century got in his whole lifetime.
Mrs. Norman says,
Their whole lifetime.
the head-jerking, funny-eyed guy in the next booth says,
Yes, but people are living longer now.
Mr. Norman, there was always carbon monoxide, says,
Where did you hear that information?
Matthew says,
Some show on French villagers. Turns out they had real problems with gum disease.
Mrs. Norman says,
The way I heard it was that a person who habitually reads newspapers knows more, in essence, than an 18th century French person.
Curtis says,
The point is that it's hard to know what to believe.
Matthew says,
No, the point is that there is a lot of stuff to believe.
Mr. Norman says,
Isn't the point that you shouldn't believe anything?
the waitress says,
Aren't those all the same point?
the reporter on the television says,
Back to you, Derek.
and that's where we will call it for today. We will continue reading this this absolute disastrous shit show of a book. It's so much fun. It's very good. It's a great satire. As you can see, things are not all happy scrappy in this vision of America. And that kind of hurts. And yet, somehow it's not as bad as it could be, right? Anyway, we'll be doing more of that next Wednesday. This Friday, we will be doing more from The Jesus Incident by Bill Ransom and Frank Herbert. And next Monday, let me double check my schedule here to make sure that there isn't something that I don't remember happening. No. Okay. I don't think there should be any problem with next Monday. Next Monday, we will keep reading Man Fac by Martin Caden. For anyone wondering about publishing date for Bear v. Shark, the novel, which I don't think I mentioned before, it was written in 2001. Well, it was published in 2001. So, it was written, therefore, before things had gotten real interesting vis-a-vis the internet and misinformation. Anyway, rather forward-looking Mr. Chris Bachelder will have him be. Anyway, hope people enjoyed this absolute goofery of a novel. It is trickily written. I'm going to continue to do my best. It changes pace dramatically later as well. How many pages is that? Jeez Louise. I might have to cut that in half. But it goes quickly because, like, chapters are like 2 pages at most. So they're really actually like 1 full page. Because like half the page is not filled with text. So it flies by. As I had intimated last week, it was going to be a choice between either this or US! Exclamation point, also by Chris Bachelder, which is also a satire, but of a different subject matter, although there is a certain degree of overlap in terms of writing style. That's a satirical book about Upton Sinclair, sort of. And basically, it's really about America's relationship with socialism, and also jingoism, and also assassination, and a few other things. It's topical, regrettably. It continues to be topical. It's topical forever, because, it's kind of the only thing I could think about the 2 times that Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. It was like, oh, that's, he called it, kind of. kind of coming from the opposite direction, really, but whatever. Anyway, that'll do it for today. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you are tuning in for the first time, listening to this after the fact, wondering, why, gosh darn it, is this so rough and bizarre? And if there were people talking, he was responding to them. Like Derpy Shark, who says, hours ago, I may be biased, but my money is on Shark. As well it could be. That's because I do these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, unless my schedule intervenes and prevents that from occurring. Starting at 12 noon U.S. East Coast time, Eastern Standard or Daylight or whatever it winds up being at that point in time. Can we seriously just get rid of that? That'd be nice. Keeps me on track. Keeps me from going off track anyway. All right, with that, I'm going to skedoodle. I will seize y'all later. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. And feel free to give your thoughts in the comments as to who would win in a fight, a bear or a shark, provided a level playing field. Alrighty, see you all next time.